I did just return from a trip to Israel where I had very productive meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the secretaries, the ministers of intelligence, a deputy foreign minister, other Israeli officials, as well as our ambassador over there and his team. The reason for going to Israel was the same as with previous visits, and that's to learn firsthand from those on the ground about the best way forward in a very volatile and dangerous region of the world, to show support for our steadfast ally, Israel. And finally, to report back to my Ohio constituents and to the Senate as we face these challenging issues we've got in the region. I saw when I was there again how since its independence in 1948, the people of Israel have not only learned how to survive, how to make do in sometimes a very unforgiving, strategic, even natural environment, but have also learned how to thrive. They boast the region's most dynamic economy now. It's also the region's most vibrant democracy. With an open society, it promotes the values of freedom, tolerance, and equality. It's a small population. They have very little land and very few natural resources, and they're faced with aggression from all sides. But throughout its history, Israel has faced its challenges through, I would say, both the power of the head and the heart, knowledge, innovation, grit, and determination to build and defend the world's one and only Jewish state and the one democracy in the region. It's against this general backdrop that I wanted to talk to the Prime Minister and other leaders about some really important topics that we face here in the Senate. One is the ongoing nuclear talks and how to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, as well as how to address Iran's current aggression all throughout the region. Second, I wanted to talk to them about the insidious campaign going on around the world. It's a campaign to delegitimize Israel through boycotts, divestments, sanctions. I've been involved in this for years. 10 years ago, I worked on this as U.S. Trade Representative. Most recently, I joined Senator Ben Cardin in a bipartisan effort that was successful in having an amendment to the trade bill that's working its way through the system to tell our trading partners, you cannot boycott, divest, and sanction Israel if you want to do business with us. Third, I wanted to talk about the myriad of challenges that do face this region and are destabilizing it right now. ISIS, the civil war in Syria, the immediate challenges Israel faces with the terror activities of Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon and now in Syria. And finally, I wanted to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, the opportunity for a peace and a two-state solution. Of all these threats, I suppose Israel's greatest threat lies in Iran. Iran has been described, by the way, as a regime that is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. So let's remember that. Remember who we're dealing with. This has been true since 1984 when they put Iran on the terrorist list. I think there are only 4 countries on it. One is Cuba that I'm sure the administration would like to remove from that list. So this is a small list of countries. According to the administration, the Iranian regime is able to produce enough material for a nuclear weapon in some time between 3 months and a year, depending on which testimony you hear from the administration. They also acknowledge that it supports terrorist groups, Hezbollah, funds other Shiite militias as it seeks regional dominance in Iraq. We've seen this now in Yemen most recently, but also in Syria and elsewhere. But they also have supported a Sunni group, Hamas, as they lob rockets into Israel. Many of those rockets have been provided, apparently, through Iran. And of course, we should not forget that this behavior comes from a regime that has pledged to annihilate, and I quote, destroy, and I quote, wipe Israel off the map, end quote. Like many of my colleagues in the Senate, I have serious concerns about the framework nuclear agreement and what may follow in a comprehensive deal. Given the importance of this issue, I feel strongly that Congress should play a role here in analyzing any agreement and approving or disapproving it. Our negotiating objective, in my view, should be an enforceable agreement, one that actually has concrete and verifiable steps to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons capability. For years, the international community demanded that Iran dismantle its nuclear program, most notably by halting all enrichment activity. If you look at the UN resolutions and the activity around that, pretty strong language. From what we know, it appears that the so-called framework agreement is still a great distance from that. I hope that can be improved, We're looking at a model of an agreement that aims to freeze the nuclear program, but somehow doesn't dismantle it. I certainly would have preferred the dismantlement model, and with the tough sanctions we put in place, I'd hoped it was doable. But given where we are, and given Israel's expertise and focus, again, I wanted to learn more about why the Israelis think the framework agreement is inadequate, and whether it could be turned in to a better agreement. There are many important questions that remain, and sadly only a few of them have satisfactory answers in the current framework agreement. In fact, the Iranian version and the U.S. version of the text seem to differ on some of the key details. So if you hear from them, they say one thing and we say another. In particular, I returned from this trip continuing my focus on what I think is perhaps the most important issue of all, which is the sanctions relief. The U.S. Congress put these sanctions in place, encouraging the administration. If we give the Iranian regime sanctions relief on day one, before they have kept their word on any deal, we will be contributing a cash windfall to Iran's ongoing efforts to further destabilize an ever-growing list of countries. Think about it: Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Yemen, and so on. So whether it's sanctions relief or whether it's releasing frozen oil revenues in banks that are all around the world, and these are proceeds from the sales of oil that are now frozen in these banks, if that becomes something the Iranians can use, that kind of financial relief, it would be a step to fuel war, not peace. So these are the right areas to focus on when it comes to Iran, not just for Israel's sake, of course, but for the sake of peace and stability in the region, and for our sake, our national security, and the world's sake. I'm hopeful we can pass the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act and safeguard Congress's role. I'm hopeful we can move to a bipartisan consensus here on the floor of the Senate about what constitutes a good deal. I believe that consensus could provide a measuring stick to determine what kind of agreement would produce a lasting peace, and also provide the administration some leverage. Give them some leverage to be able to negotiate a more effective agreement by having that debate here on the floor of the Senate. Attacks on Israel, of course, don't always come from rockets, missiles, or other violent means. Increasingly, opponents of Israel are using economic weapons to target Israel. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, also called BDS, is an effort to undermine Israel's sovereignty and further isolate it from the international community, really delegitimize the state. Senator Cardin and I recently authored the U.S.-Israel Trade Enhancement Act of 2015. It has a very simple purpose. It says that the United States will leverage trade to stop efforts to delegitimize Israel. Especially when, as I look at it, having just been there, some of these BDS efforts actually harm the Palestinians in the West Bank, who I think some of these efforts are meant to help. Our legislation leverages ongoing trade negotiations to discourage our trading partners from engaging in this economic discrimination. I've seen how it works. I know trade can be effective. We did this with Oman when I was in the U.S. Trade Representative's office as they wanted to negotiate a trade agreement. Same with Bahrain. Both of those agreements ended up removing their boycotts of Israel. I saw it with Saudi Arabia when I negotiated for their accession to the WTO, where again we were able to make progress in providing, in that case, equal treatment to Israel. I'm proud that the Cardin-Portman Amendment was the first and one of only 3 amendments to pass out of the Finance Committee when we took up the Trade Promotion Authority bill. In my meetings with the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, my meetings with the Foreign Ministry, Israeli national security officials, and my discussions with the Prime Minister, I gained some additional insights in how BDS actually works in practice, and I came home more resolved than ever to work in a bipartisan way to ensure that we don't have this discrimination and painfully obvious double standard with Israel. For instance, it only advocates isolation and penalties in Israel, not other countries, over territorial disputes, turning a blind eye really to other territorial disputes around the world. Finally, I talked to officials at length about the general turmoil in the Middle East and Israel's relationship with its neighbors. This deteriorating regional security environment includes Egypt's battle against Hamas and radicals in the Sinai, the brutal war in Syria, the destabilizing role of Iran-backed Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon and Syria, threats and challenges to our ally Jordan, the brutality of ISIS, and the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. So I returned from my trip with my concerns reinforced over the threats to the region. But I also returned with hope, because whether I was touching the ancient stones of the Western Wall, walking the Stations of the Cross in the Old City, amidst the Old City Market, standing amidst the worshipers in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or marveling at the modern hustle and bustle of Tel Aviv, I saw a remarkable phenomenon up close. A small but determined country that carries within its narrow borders the ancient wisdom of our great faiths, the cutting-edge innovations, and the can-do spirit of the modern state of Israel. All of this combines to bring me back to this floor with a greater resolve to meet these challenges we talked about today for our own national security, but also for that of our steadfast ally, Israel.